Dr. Allen is an assistant professor of exercise science at Florida Southern College. He has a PhD in kinesiology from the University of Mississippi and over 10 years experience as a fitness professional. Dr. Allen is a certified strength conditioning specialist with distinction and tactical strength conditioning facilitator certified by the NSCA, as well as a level 1 performance coach certified by USA Weightlifting. Without further ado, Dr. Charles Allen.
So this whole mic thing is kind of new for me. So the title of my presentation today is Concurrent Activation Potentiation, Inconsequential Event, or Viable Ergogenic Strategy. I kind of went with this title for two reasons. One, this is kind of the narrative that is out there in terms of the literature. It's a thing, whether it's a useful thing or not, that's still debatable. But secondly, I'm just not very clever. I wanted to come up with a clever title, I couldn't do it, so you get what you get. A little bit about me, again, undergrad in physical education with a teacher's certificate from Coastal Carolina University. From there, I went to Ole Miss, the University of Mississippi, as a master's student studying exercise science. Got really heavily involved in campus recreation, got my first professional position at the University of Tampa as campus rec coordinator. At the time, UT did not have strength conditioning staff. They contracted out their strength conditioning services, so I actually had the opportunity while there to do a little bit of work with volleyball and baseball. Ended up back at Ole Miss working with campus rec. While there, I pursued my PhD part-time. Our lab, the biomechanics lab at Ole Miss, had a great relationship with Coach Paul Jackson, the strength staff there, as well as the Olympic staff, so we did a lot of work with them. 2015, Dr. Sarah Terrell gave me the opportunity to come to Florida Southern and be a college professor. It's been a great experience ever since. A couple of thank yous. Definitely wanted to thank Coach Ayers and the Weber Strength staff for constantly putting on this clinic. This is my 4th year coming as an attendee, 1st year as a presenter. Just the opportunity that they provide us, as well as our students, is incredible, so I really appreciate that. I also want to thank my colleagues at Florida Southern, Dr. Terrell, Dr. Rice, Dr. Lynch, just huge resources and mentors to me so far. Also got to thank Coach Zach Wallace. He's a Weber Strength staff alum. Some people say he's my brother. We look very much alike. Coach has given me the opportunity to be in the weight room there, working with some athletes, volleyball and softball specifically. So it's just great to have that opportunity to be both in the classroom and still in the weight room as a practitioner. So, overview of today's presentation, going to talk about what concurrent activation potentiation is, the proposed mechanisms of action, evidence potentially for and against it as an ergogenic strategy, strategies for implementation if you so choose, and potential future directions of the research that's going on. The image here of the Hulk is not random. I'm a huge Marvel Comics fan. Also, hopefully the whole idea here of clinching and strength, jaw clinching becomes pretty prevalent as we go through. The Hulk, it's not actually science fiction, it's science. The angrier he gets, the more he snarls, the more he clenches, the stronger he gets. So we'll talk about that. So question for you, show of hands, when you're doing something, exerting maximal force, do you find yourself clenching your teeth, creating tension in the face, the neck, holding your breath, anything like that? Yes, no, maybe so.
Yes.
Yeah, for sure. So the question is, why? Why does that happen? In theory, there's something behind that. Why is that a thing? Why does it happen for a lot of people? So when exerting maximal force, maximal muscular effort, it's somewhat common for people to clench the jaw. This was a statement from Dr. William Evan in 2006 when he first introduced the term concurrent activation potentiation in the literature. We see a great example of it here with Franco Colombo, a very well accomplished bodybuilder and powerlifter. Huge amount of tension in the face, gritting the teeth, squinting the eyes. And the idea here is that that's purposeful. right? That connection, that automatic thing that happens has a benefit, and that benefit is potentiation, right? So a basic definition of potentiation is to make something stronger or more effective. And in terms of exercise science, it's typically classified in terms of time course of action. Okay, so many of you have probably heard of post-activation potentiation, where you do some sort of activity and that activity leads to a potentiation of the subsequent activity. Right? So in the literature, commonly we see heavy squats or heavy lower body exercises potentiates vertical jump performance or some sort of explosive activity like that. Concurrent activation potentiation is defined as the increase in prime mover muscular performance or activity by doing something simultaneous. And that simultaneous action is involving muscles that aren't involved in the activity. So as in our image here with Franco, he's deadlifting. The jaw muscles and the muscles of the face are not involved at all in that activity, yet they're being activated with the purpose of potentiating performance of those prime movers. So that's our definition of CAP. Another definition for you is remote voluntary contraction. This again is a literature term for the activating of muscles that are not involved in the activity. Okay, so common examples again are jaw clenching. Other examples in the literature are clenching of the fists, holding the breath, the Valsalva maneuver, activating those diaphragmatic muscles like that. So there's some anecdotal evidence for the benefit of clenching or biting down on something. Okay, so Roman soldiers were said to place leather straps between their teeth to improve their performance in battle. Additionally, we see that Native American women have bit down on sticks during childbirth to ease the pain of delivery. And probably really interesting here, the Civil War soldiers who were wounded in battle, going through surgery on the battlefield, remember, no such thing as anesthesia at this time. So to deal with having those limbs severed and the surgeries that they had to go through, they were given bullets to bite down on, hence the phrase, bite the bullet. Proposed mechanisms of action, okay? So again, this is the nerd in me, the scientist in me, you'll have to bear with me momentarily. One proposed mechanism that makes sense and there's evidence for is this idea of motor overflow, okay? And this is dealing with the brain. In the adult brain, there are 80 to 100 billion neurons. Every neuron has hundreds, if not thousands of synapses with other neurons. So it should make sense that in the motor cortex of the brain, that when you're activating one area, so the part of the brain that controls the face, when you're activating that musculature, and that brain lights up, it's firing, those neurons are firing, that it bleeds over into other areas, right? The brain is a giant sponge. The language of communication of the body is electricity. A watery sponge, it's going to transfer, okay? That's one proposed mechanism. The other is this idea of inhibition of presynaptic inhibition. Okay? So our image here is of a motor unit. So we have this neuron with some muscle fibers here. And right here, just before this synaptic cleft, we have this inhibitory neuron acting on this excitatory neuron. And so what we see here is with these synapses where there's no inhibitory signal, we get that neurotransmitter release and we get a response from those muscle fibers. Here, this inhibitory signal stops that action potential from transferring over the synaptic cleft and causing a response. Same thing here, instead of presynaptic, we have preneuronic, so this inhibitory signal stops this excitatory signal and we get no response. The mechanism here is that this inhibition is prevented, right? So the inhibitory signal is overcome or it's not present so that we actually do get greater response here or here. At the end of the day, as a practitioner, who cares, right? Doesn't matter how it works, as long as it works. Okay? So, looking at the research. Since the term was presented in the literature in 2006, there have been 11 studies conducted purely on the idea of remote voluntary contractions generating concurrent activation potentiation. There's a lot more research where CAP comes into play via other mechanisms, but that research is a little more convoluted. Rather than try to dive into that, we're just going to keep it simple. So what we see in terms of this, a lot of this research, is that many force production variables, things like rate of force development, time to peak force, peak torque, average torque, they all seem to be enhanced as a result of clenching the jaw, squeezing or clenching the fist, Valsalva maneuver, etc. This study, conducted in 2010, we see peak force and rate of force development improved in back squat and jump squat. The jump squat has an asterisk because this is the first instance where actual jump height was demonstrated to be improved, right? So we have these improvements in force variables and not necessarily demonstration of improvement of the actual performance in the activity. Does that make sense? Okay, so we're getting improvements in variables of performance, but not actually outcome of performance. And so this group, and you see a lot of the same names here being cited, this group was essentially trying to establish that CAP was the thing, Dr. Evan and his research group. This was the first one showing performance. Then we have some actual performance enhancement, right? So swimmers were on the starting block. At the ready signal, they were told to clench the jaw, voluntarily activate the abdominal muscles. And when the gun sounded, after a 15 meter mark, they were actually there faster, right? So the theory is that CAP improved that race start. Another study looking at specifically the time course of action. Okay, so where does the CAP come into effect? And it's really early on. Okay, so the initial 500 to 1,000 milliseconds. So once the RVC is initiated, you only have about a second of benefit. But in terms of performance, that may be all we need, right? Where does vertical jump performance where is it determined? It's early on. Where is rate of force development measured? Very early on. So if we can impact those variables, we can improve performance. These other research groups that's interesting, but there's not a lot of legitimate transfer to sport performance, and so they did some studies. Jumped ahead of the slide. Let me back up. Key points to take away from those studies that we just talked about. Concurrent activation potentiation is directly related to the quantity of remote voluntary contraction. So the more remote voluntary musculature you can activate, the better. Okay, so if you're clenching the jaw versus clenching the jaw maximally, clenching the jaw versus clenching the jaw and performing the Valsalva maneuver, the more the better. Aggregate RVC leads to greater CAP over an isolated. So if we can activate multiple remote muscle groups, the greater the CAP response. Jaw clenching alone is sufficient to produce CAP. So a lot of our activities, our sports performance movements, there's not a lot of remote voluntary musculature that we can activate. It's full body, it's total body stuff. So it's hard to produce aggregate CAP. Therefore, it's beneficial to know that clenching alone is enough to create a positive effect. But if we can do more than just clench, great. And through the research, it's believed that this phenomenon is more beneficial in men than women. So of these studies, when gender differences were taken into account, it seemed that more of the positive performance was seen in male athletes or male participants rather than female. And I have some thoughts on that. I don't necessarily think that there's gender difference in terms of those neural pathways, but I do have some thoughts on why that might be, and we'll talk about that. a little later. So this research group, again, a different group of folks than before, kind of like, yeah, that's interesting. You know, we get those improvements in rate of force development and peak force during, you know, jumping and isometric movements and isokinetic movements, but does it really translate to sports performance? So this first study here, again, looked at vertical jump performance. No changes in jump height, peak force, time to peak force, rate of force development. Another study looking at golf. Golf shot precision, length, or club head velocity was not improved via clenching of the jaw during performance. Some measurement of soccer kick and throwing velocities, not improved when clenching the jaw. So here's a learning opportunity, particularly for my students, right? We typically look at research and we're like, wow, this is published in a legitimate journal. There's probably something here. How is it that we can have studies that show positive changes via jaw clenching or via RVC, and then studies that show nothing? What's the difference? In all of these studies, there was performance improvement in the jaw clench, the RVC conditions. It just was not statistically significant, right? So statistical procedures play a role in terms of outcome, right? Additionally, there's some methodological differences here. The study on vertical jump, very, very similar to this very first study here done by Dr. Evan in terms of vertical jump performance and these force parameters. Dr. Evan saw improvement. This research group did not. Difference in timing of the RVC implementation. Dr. Evans' group, simultaneous. As you initiate the jump, you clench the jaw. This group, 3 seconds prior to initiating the jump, they started clenching the jaw. So the timing of the RVC implementation becomes important. Okay? Still improved performance, not enough to be statistically significant. With this study, the soccer kick and throw in, kick velocity improved on average 2 kilometers per hour. That, to me, that's a performance enhancement, right? Even though statistically there's no difference. So we can argue about statistical significance versus practical significance another time, but that's enhancement, right? This was done in female athletes, 14 subjects, so a relatively small sample size. And again, those potential gender differences in activation here. Recently, this past fall, with one of our students who's on the softball team, we did some bat swing velocity research using an inertial measurement unit. You guys may be familiar with the ZEP sensor. You can not attach it to the end of the bat head or to the end of a tennis racket or anything like that. And it calculates swing velocity based on how it moves in space, right? So with our softball athletes, again, small sample size, all female, we only had 13 participants. On average, 3 mile per hour increase in bat swing velocity when they clenched versus when the jaw maintained a relaxed state. And this didn't matter how we looked at the data, right? So I looked at it 4 different ways. I averaged all 3 trials under each condition, about a 3 mile per hour difference. I took the peak trial from each condition, so the absolute maximum trial, about 3 miles per hour difference. We eliminated the first and the last trial and took the middle trial. Again, about a 3 mile per hour difference. And then I dropped the highest and the lowest trial and looked at that, still about a 3 mile per hour difference. Statistically significant. We've submitted this research to be presented at the NSCA National Conference, so hopefully that'll be accepted. So again, methodology is important. And if you're unable to determine those differences in methodology, you may write something like this off when in actuality there's potential benefit. So when I first got to Florida Southern, I did a lot of this research, the CAP stuff, with my dissertation. And I was trying to think of how could I continue with this line of research. And I don't know if you noticed, but I've noticed that in recent years, many Olympic weightlifters, when initiating the first pull off the ground, are opening the jaw. So I'm like, wonder what the thought process is there. Hopped online, tried to do a search, could not really find anything as to why that might be a case. So I was like, hey, that's an opportunity for me to do some research and figure it out. Sat down and did a YouTube binge. So in 2018, I sat down and looked at every weight category, men and women, from the 2017 World Weightlifting Championships. That's 177 athletes. About 50% of them did something with their face, right? Whether it was clenching or creating tension or puffing out the jaws. 49 of them opened the jaw. That's about 28% of those athletes. And then recently, the December issue of Strength and Conditioning, I saw this on the cover, right? So again, why? Definitely not for aesthetics, right? What's the purpose in doing this? It's not a new idea, right? So Kakis Villas, Pierce Demas's teammate from Greece, 1996, Olympic gold medalist, jaw opening on the pull. Really way back, Kurt White, a U.S. Competitor in the Pan Am Games in '77, again, jaw open. So it's not a new thing, but why is it the case, okay? So, doing some research on maximal jaw opening, we found that jump height, when measured by the Just Jump map, again, simple, quick, easy, and grip strength, bilateral, left and right hand, was improved over a jaw relaxed condition in men. I did 24 men, 24 women in the study. Performance was again improved in women, just not statistically significant. Okay, this was presented as an abstract in 2017 at NSCA. It's in review currently for publication. Most recently, just finished some data collection with several students, a couple of them are in the back, looking at submaximal deadlift performance, but focusing on velocity of movement, right? So we all know our force-velocity relationship. We know Newton's second law, force equals mass times acceleration. If you're able to apply greater force to the same mass, you should accelerate it, and therefore it should have a higher velocity. And that's exactly what we found. Using a Tendo unit to evaluate bar speed velocity, at 65% of participants 1RM, we saw improvements in average and peak velocity, as well as average and peak power, as well as peak force, right? We did perform these off of the force plate. This force value here is from the Tendo. I have yet to process the force plate data. So definite evidence here for jaw opening as an ergogenic strategy as well. So, considerations and how to potentially implement this if you find value. If you're an athlete like me who's marginal at best, right? You're looking for any kind of advantage you can get. If you're going to implement RVCs, they need to be maximal. So if it's clenching, it needs to be a maximal clench. If it's jaw opening, it should be maximal open. Okay? And incorporate as much facial and neck musculature into that as you can, right? One of my theories as to why we're not seeing as great of activation in women, particularly in the jaw open condition, is because when we did that study with deadlifting, and I asked them to open their jaw maximally, this is what I got, right? Because even in a room where it's just me, another student researcher, and them, they're not necessarily willing to go full out and give me this, right? There's this idea of, I don't want to look foolish, and that's fair. I want to win, so I'm down with that. It has to be timed appropriately, right? So it either has to be performed simultaneously with the initiation of a movement or just moments before. Our cues for the research for the deadlift was clench and go or open and go. And for the control condition, it was relax and go. If possible, incorporate multiple remote voluntary contractions. In the study that Dr. Eben did looking at back squat and jump squat performance, they had those athletes clinch, squeeze the bar with their hands, pull the bar down into the traps, and do the Valsalva movement. Okay? So the more musculature that can be involved in the movement, the better. If it has to be a single RVC, jaw opening and jaw closing are effective. Clenching and opening maximally are effective. And based on the numbers from that deadlift stuff, it appears that opening might provide a slightly higher advantage than clenching. Not sure why. The masseter muscle is larger than the pterygoid muscle group, which opens the jaw. So that kind of goes a little bit against the whole more musculature, greater CAP. So still haven't quite figured that out. Additional considerations. In none of the studies did performing the RVC condition actually reduce performance. So as a coach, if this is something you're interested in, you can confidently implement it with all your athletes and not have to worry about it actually impeding someone's performance. Right? However, there is a caveat to this. And it goes back a little bit to what Coach Taylor was talking about this morning with the motor behavior stuff and attention. Right? Attention capacity as a potential limiting factor. So what I mean by that is, in terms of the motor behavior research and stuff, what we find is that when you're trying to simultaneously perform multiple motor tasks, that it's possible for those tasks to compete against each other for your attention. And we all have a limited attention capacity. A pretty classic example of two motor tasks competing against each other are texting and driving. Right? So you're trying to drive the car, you're trying to navigate and text at the same time. You can't fully and actively give your attention to both, and therefore performance of one of those suffers. Well, same idea here. If opening the jaw maximally is completely novel to you as an athlete, if you focus on jaw opening, you're probably not focusing as much on the activity of interest and probably aren't going to perform it as well. Conversely, if you're focusing on the activity of interest, you're probably not going to activate the jaw maximally, and therefore you may not get as great a benefit as CAP. So there needs to be some sort of learning or familiarization phase involved in this, particularly if it's a novel activity. Again, most of us in here, we should be able to implement clenching pretty easily because we say that's pretty normal for us, right? So we can clench and perform the activity and not have that impede. My suggestion would be that if you're going to do an implementation, that you do it obviously at lighter weights or in off-season performance so that that doesn't actually impede the specifics of in-season performance. For future directions, I think it's pretty well established that it is a thing for acute performance enhancement, right? Whether it's actual outcome performance or even just variables of the performance itself. I'm interested to know is if incorporating these RVCs can lead to greater adaptation over time. So we're talking a training study, right? So the idea here would be to have two relatively well-matched groups performing the exact same type of training. The only differences is we limit jaw activity or remote voluntary contractions in one group, we encourage it and ensure it in the other group, and take pre and post measures to see if adaptation changes to a greater extent. I don't know that it will, but I'm interested to know. These are the references of things that I've cited. Thank you very much. This is my contact information. I don't have the social media presence that most of you guys probably have, so email and cell phone will work. Happy to answer any questions I can for you at this time. Coach.
A lot of times when testing with mouth open, was yelling a factor in that?
It was not something that was implemented or encouraged. It didn't occur on its own. It wasn't discouraged though.
about running, like sprinting, high level, maximal output and sprints, you see the relaxation of jaw in those Olympic sprinters, but they're still trying to produce maximum force. Is there something different with running than lifting?
I don't know the answer in terms of different pathways or mechanisms. I haven't seen it tested as a potential strategy with running. The prevailing thought process is that it's going to be more single effort rather than the repetitive motor pattern of something like running or cycling or anything like that.
My question is kind of related to that. So looking at the different studies you put on there of squat strength, pull strength, or jump height, it maybe seemed like the things that were high velocity based or elastic based seem to have less improvement than muscular force production based. Have you evaluated either of those?
In terms of research, again, that's another one of those caveats, right? As a researcher, it's much easier for me to pull those variables from an isometric movement or from something that is high force based and not as much ballistic or explosive, even though we can and have seen that, particularly in the vertical jump.
Sure.
So some of it is ease and limitations of research. It's not to say, I don't think we can say just yet that it's not applicable in those. I don't personally have the capability of making measurements in those areas, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But you're right, there does seem to be a prevalence more for the force and more for isometric, and which again potentially has its limitations as in terms of transfer to sport performance, but some of that is done in terms of being able to pull the data from a clinical or controlled standpoint. So that's why the whole is still a debate, right? It's a thing for sure. Is it a useful thing?
So I've seen people use
No, I'll go to him next. Sorry.
I've seen people use mouth guard. Does that affect anything with the maximal jaw clenching, or does that have anything to do with that? Or for a football player that has that in, will that affect anything on the field, or have you seen anything with that?
Sure, that's a great question, and that's where that convoluted literature that I was mentioning comes in. There's a ton of stuff out there from a bunch of different populations on performance mouth guards, or do mouth guards, or is there a performance benefit for wearing a mouth guard? My dissertation was exactly that. We had, my dissertation was looking specifically at the Under Armour Armor Bite performance mouthpiece, right? It's not a protective mouthpiece, but it's the mouthpiece that has the bite plates on it. My contention was there's no way that this boil and bite mouthpiece aligns the jaw, which was the proposed mechanism behind those mouthpieces, to create this performance enhancement, yet quite a bit of the literature was showing that it was. And so what I found was there was no control for the amount of jaw activity in those mouthpiece positions. If you have something in your mouth, are you likely to bite down on it? Yeah, I think so. It's hard for me to say that simply by inserting the mouthpiece performance will improve. So my design was looking at 6 different variables: mouthpiece in, no clinch, mouthpiece in, clinch, traditional mouth guard, clinch, no mouth guard, clinch, no clinch. Nothing from the mouthpieces or guards at all. So wearing a mouth guard did not inhibit the CAP that was found purely from clinching. We did vertical jump, we did isometric clean pull. So force variables in clean pull were improved. EMG and vertical jump was improved. So those CAP effects were present regardless of whether you had the performance mouthpiece, the mouth guard, or no mouth guard. Conversely, when we looked at it from the other side, there were no improvements directly related to the mouth guards or mouthpiece, right? So there is some stuff out there on dentistry design mouthpieces. So if you go have a dental impression made, and then they design that performance mouthpiece to fit specifically for you to properly align the temporomandibular joint, there does seem to be some effect. But that's thousands of dollars, and that becomes cost prohibitive to a lot of people, right? The boil and bite over-the-counter version, that's $25 at Dick's Sporting Goods, doesn't produce the same effect, right? Does that answer your question?
Yeah.
Sir.
So I have same question, that the secondary question off of that is, when you're cueing an athlete to do either the clenching or opening the mouth, have you seen any negative effects, whether it's technique or the brazenness, throwing that off, since there's multiple things that are comprehend at one time?
I haven't, in terms of my own implementation with folks, you know, with the softball team and hitting, I saw really no changes there in terms of hitting mechanics. I haven't, with any of my athletes in the weight room, said, hey, we're gonna do this as a team. Right? I haven't done that yet. I'm still trying to decide myself whether it's worth it or not. In terms of research, again, vertical jump attempts can be different from attempt to attempt based on your skill and abilities, right? Most of my research were done with recreationally trained athletes, you know, so I can't say that there was a difference there. With a lot of the research that Dr. Evan did were with highly trained athletes, D2 athletes, D1 athletes, professional athletes. The assumption there is that the technique is better, they have a greater training history. Again, didn't seem to be an issue. Rich in the back, and then we'll come back.
Thinking about the athletes, back in the 90s, there was this league, we had a national team that they actually made them with the dentist. And at that point, they were looking more at spinal alignment as a mechanism. In your research, did you find any of that information?
There seems to be a lot with TMJ alignment and posture, which I think relates well to spinal alignment. There does seem to be something to the whole TMJ position. A little hazy on the anatomy, but there's the paraventricular nucleus, that group of nerves that pass through that medullary space in the joint, has a lot to do with postural control and things like that. So if we're out of alignment, there's potential there. I mean, people with TMJ obviously have symptoms. TMJ is a temporomandibular joint disorder. So headaches, balance issues, dizziness, things of that nature. When a MORA, a mandibular orthopedic repositioning appliance, is created for those people, it does improve their symptoms. And a lot of the mouthpiece research stems off of that. But what constitutes a properly aligned jaw, right? All of us in here, is anyone, I know there's one student in here that has TMJ. Does anyone else have temporomandibular joint disorder? So in theory, all of us have properly aligned jaws, but I would bet that if we had a dentist come in and do an evaluation, that there's individual differences, right? So what constitutes an optimal position? Apparently there is such thing that is achievable by those devices. But so short answer is yes, that stuff is there, and I think that's some of where the basis of the current performance literature is at relative to mouthpieces. Sir.
I was wondering if you think that the jaw open, if that would affect the valsalva maneuver and holding that intra-abdominal pressure throughout the
Don't know. I don't have the capability of controlling for jaw activation other than to cue normal breathing, right? So in the literature, most of the control conditions where they're not measuring jaw activity via EMG, the control condition is open mouth, pursed lip breathing. So when you're focusing on breathing through the mouth, the idea is that you're less likely to clench, okay? Or anything like that. I can measure masseter muscle because it's a surface muscle, right? I have EMG capabilities. I can't measure pterygoid muscle activity in a jaw open position, right? So my only mechanism of control is to cue pursed lip breathing. So I've eliminated the Valsalva maneuver in all my conditions because I know that that's potential for a confounding factor, but I can't control with it any other way. Does that make sense? So I don't know the answer to that. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.